Welcome, everybody. Thank you for coming out on a Thursday night and joining us on Zoom. I am so pleased to have Dr. Wagner again with us, and he's going to be telling us about everything we need to know about this 2020 election coming up in, I guess, less than a month. So, Dr. Wagner, thank you so much for joining us on this evening.
Thank you. It is good to be back. All right. Hopefully everybody can see my slides. My name is Kevin Wagner. I'm a professor of political science at Florida Atlantic University, and I study campaigns and elections. So obviously this is a very slow time of year for me. Not much going on at all. All right, maybe a little bit going on. I do comment pretty regularly on politics. So if you want to see what I'm talking about on any given day, you are always welcome to follow me on Twitter if you have Twitter. Me and President Trump are both on Twitter, and you can follow me at Kevin Wagner, PhD. If not, that's okay too. But if you want to see what the president has to say, that's a good place to go, without a doubt. Let me see here. All right, if I look a little bit familiar, that is me. I am occasionally, as some of you noted beforehand, I am occasionally seen on television. Generally speaking, I think that's a bad idea. As my friends are fond of telling me, I generally have a face for radio. But I do periodically do television, mostly for two basic reasons. I do a lot of polling, and so the stations will have me on to talk about polling. I also talk a lot about the Constitution and how that works, and so you might hear me about that. And of course, I do election analysis as well. If you're interested in how the Constitution works, things like the Electoral College, I would invite you. I write a weekly column in the Palm Beach Post every Sunday called the Civics Project, and where I answer questions about civics and government. Feel free to send me a question if you'd like, or just read the column, or if it doesn't interest you, certainly don't read the column. I should say before I get too deep into this, even though I do a fair amount of television, that is not my recommended source for information on the election. In fact, I generally think television, because the segments are generally pretty small and the amount of information you can get is not all that great. I generally would encourage you to get your information from a broad number of sources and not just television, though. The last time I checked, I think still the #1 source of information on politics is still television. Which is a little troubling to me in some ways. I mean, I don't know. How many of you still watch your local news? Does anyone still watch it? Just by a show of hands. Let me scan through here. Do you watch your? A few do. I've been on it, so I suppose I shouldn't be watching it more. But if you go far enough back, television news was sort of the prestige division. For national stations and even local stations. They did a lot of news. Nowadays, they do a fair amount of sports and weather. Well, not as much sports anymore, but certainly a lot of weather. I remember a few years back, I used to do the morning show on the weekends on CBS 12 as their political person. And I asked the anchor one time, I mean, how many times do you have to go to weather? Because we would go to weather like every 10 minutes. And I was like, really? Because it can't possibly have changed in 10 minutes. And he's like, that's what people want to watch. That's what people want to watch. So, but I will not be giving you the weather today. So you are definitely out of luck on that. So I want to share with you, this was just released yesterday, but that's in fact not true. We actually released it on Tuesday. So it's a couple of days old. This is the FAU, Florida Atlantic University, poll of the presidential race for Florida and only Florida. This is a Florida poll. And in fact, what you're looking at is 4 Florida polls all in one chart, because I aim to please. And if you go back, you can see the March numbers here, the May numbers, the September numbers, and then the October numbers, which were the ones that were taken just a couple of days ago. So if you go back to March, you can see that we had Trump slightly ahead. And if you get to May, you can see we had Biden actually a 6-point lead. That was actually a fairly substantial lead. That was his high water mark. The poll we did in September, and this was around the mid-September 11th or 12th, we basically had it tied And then you can see our last poll here that we just did, and we have Biden up about 4 points. All right, so a little tidbit about polling, in case you don't know. So look up here and see what we did. We gave you our margins of error. You can see 2.7 here, 3.1 here, 3.8 here, and 3.8 here. It's in part a product of the sampling size. In other words, how big your sample is compared to the population you're measuring. But it's important to understand that if something is within the margin of error, it is essentially statistically tied. In other words, we don't know who's actually winning. So if you go back to this March poll here, the margin of error is almost 3 points. So let's say 3 points, and you can see that they're within 2 points. So this really means statistically tied. But if you go to the May poll, it's a 3-point difference. You can see there's actually 6-point difference. So this is not tied. Biden actually was ahead. This is tied, and our margin of error here is about 3.8, almost 4%. So this is almost just outside the margin of error. So this is a slight lead for Joe Biden, and still pretty close. I did the Florida Pulse TV show that they do through the USA Today network. Literally, I was there about 10 minutes ago when we finished up, and the anchor asked me right before I left. She asked me, "Who is going to win Florida?" And because they always seem to want to know. And I said, I gave an honest answer, which is probably why I don't have my own TV show, which is I don't know. I don't know. What I can tell you is that it's consistently close. And when they're that close, it means that a little bit of movement, say the Trump voters come out in higher numbers because they're excited, or the Biden voters come out in higher numbers because they're a little more excited, a little bit of movement can be the difference between who wins and who loses. And when that is the truth, right? Like if Biden were up by 10 points, I would tell you I feel pretty comfortable, because even if Trump does a little bit better, it's not going to make a difference. But if you're telling me that Trump could make up 2 or 3 points between now and Election Day, I tell you that's certainly possible. And because of that, I don't feel comfortable making a prediction about Florida. The only one I'm really comfortable about is saying that it's going to be pretty close. Another way I would put it is that if you hear anyone on television, pollster, not pollster, pundit, anyone say they know Biden is going to win, or they know Trump is going to win, they're either a liar or a time traveler, because there just really isn't enough evidence for us to feel very comfortable. One other thought while we're talking about polls, and I have my own poll up here, it is very, very, very important to remember that polls are not really predictions. They're evidence that can help you make a prediction, but they are not a prediction themselves. What do I mean by that? I mean, a poll is asking what you think right now. That doesn't mean you never change your mind, right? I mean, for example, like if I polled my wife on where she wanted to go for dinner, the answer that I get at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, and 5 o'clock are all different. All different. And that doesn't mean the answer she gave me at 3 o'clock was wrong. It just changed between 3 and 4 o'clock. And people's opinions can change. One of the key elements I've always thought for the 2016 election, the Trump-Clinton election, that really made a big difference was the Comey letter that came out, right before people voted. Really did have a fairly large influence on people that were, leaning slightly maybe in Hillary Clinton's direction or unsure. It really did give them a push in favor of Trump, enough so that he was able to get a very narrow margin in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, about 70,000 votes. And that was enough for him to sweep those states and basically create the margin that he won by. So these things can happen. Sometimes in politics, we call it the October surprise. I don't know, we're going to get an October surprise this time, but something can happen that could shake up the race. Doesn't mean that the polls that were taken before that October surprise were bad. It just means that they happened before. So keep an eye on it. I think Florida is going to be very close. At FAU, we're going to do one more poll before the election, probably in about a week or so, maybe 10 days. And we'll see if Joe Biden's numbers continue to be slightly ahead of Trump's. But we'll see. I just had a conversation with a colleague of mine up at the University of North Florida. They did their own poll. They use a slightly different methodology than we do. We use calling of landlines, we use online, and we use texting surveys to people. They use a live phone bank of people calling, and our numbers actually came out pretty close. But we were talking about another poll, a Inside Politics poll that actually had Trump ahead. That was a different methodology too. That was just straight computer calling. So there is some evidence that Trump might be doing better than our poll says. But I guess we'll know the truth a little bit when the vote finally comes in. So I'm going to share with you some research, especially since we're talking about how people change their mind. I'm going to share with you some research that was done by 3 scholars at Duke University, who I thought did a really amazing job at getting at a question that they ask about all the time on television, especially when it comes to elections. And I thought this was very, very good research, and so I wanted to share it with you. So the name of the paper they put together is called "Resistance to Positional Change, Motivated Reasoning, and Polarization," which is a typically good political science title, indecipherable. But the research is actually very good. So what they actually were asking themselves, and a very interesting question, which I hope you might find interesting too, is what does it take to change a person's mind about a political issue? In other words, if somebody has a position, like I think that we should have tariffs against China or something like that, what convinces them to change their mind? And so they did what amounts to basically an experiment. They got the background and prior knowledge of the person, and then they asked them to make an initial decision about one of several different issues. And then after they got their decision and how strongly they supported it, they put them in one of 3 groups. One group got basically information that told them that their decision was wrong. Conflicting information, all these facts that say your information is wrong. Another group got a bunch of facts that said the decision that they made was totally right. And a third group got a little of each, some confirming information and some contrary information. And then they looked to see, did it make any difference? And the fascinating thing was that for all 5 issues that they used, and they used stuff like support for fracking, animal testing, drone strikes, the gold standard, standardized testing, and they noted for all 5 issues, no matter what set of reasons was evaluated, affirming reasons, conflicting reasons, or mixed, the participants were always more likely to stick with their initial decision than to change it. So even if they were confronted with facts that showed that they might have well been wrong, their response generally was to say, you know what? I'm right. I can't possibly be wrong. And this, I think, is the fundamental truth of American politics right now, that we are in a post-fact universe, right? You don't convince people with facts. So here's a good tip for you, by the way, if you're going to go talk to your neighbors and friends and you think that they might be wrong about their politics, don't give them facts. That is not persuasive. In fact, I don't know if I've ever said this to this group. I've been here a few times. I did this experiment with one person by accident, and that was my mother, who talked to me one time and said something. It doesn't really matter what she said, but she took a position on something that happened. And usually I don't talk politics with my mother because I love my mother, and political conversations between us are not generally healthy. So I try not to sort of say anything. But she said something, and I said to her, I said, Mom, I love you, but that is factually incorrect. And she looked at me surprised, and I said, look, this is what we literally know as being factually true. And I laid out 3 or 4 or 5 different facts to her. And she looked at me, and I still remember this. This will be frozen in my brain forever. She looked at me and she said, Kevin, always with you, the facts. I have enough facts. I don't need any more facts. And she really didn't. She was convinced that her position was correct no matter what facts I brought to the table. That is sort of the amazing thing about American politics, because we spend so much time, you see these campaigns working left and right, trying to give you all this information to maybe persuade you about something. And it turns out most Americans are not all that persuadable. They just are not. And if you think about it, part of the reason is that it's so much work to change your mind once you've made it up, right? And once you've convinced it, 2 things have to happen for you to change your mind, at least 2 things, right? One is you have to be willing to admit that you might have been wrong. Now, that's a tough one right there, right? You have to admit that. And two, you have to do the work of considering new information and applying it to what you already know to reach a new conclusion, which, by the way, is indeed work. For most people, once they make a decision, that decision is well formed, they don't want to revisit it. They'd have to go, oh, well, I was wrong, and now I got to think about this again. And it's really hard. It's one of the reasons, by the way, that politicians, once people form an opinion of them, it's very hard to get them to change. In fact, for most of us, we have a very simple opinion generally of most politicians. Like if I've said the name Dan Quayle, you think what? Not too smart, right? Can't spell potato. For the record, by the way, he did really well financially, apparently, as in the investment world. So he probably was a little smarter than we gave him credit for, but that's sort of what we remember about him, right? Mitt Romney, rich guy that's not, that doesn't understand America, right? That's sort of the perception of Mitt Romney, though it's changed a little bit more recently. Here's an easy one: Sarah Palin. Right? What jumps to mind when I say Sarah Palin? How many of you, just by a show of hands, when I say Sarah Palin, the first thing that jumps into your head is, I can see Russia from my house? How many of you? Come on, be honest. Yeah, that's what I thought. I will point out, by the way, for the record, she never actually said that. That is not a true story. She never said that. And you're looking at me going, of course she said that. I remember her saying it. I have a picture in my mind of her saying it. What you're actually thinking about is Tina Fey, who said that on Saturday Night Live. Yeah, true story. In fairness, though, Sarah Palin did suggest that her vast knowledge of foreign affairs had something to do with the proximity of Russia to Alaska. So it wasn't entirely a baseless joke, but it was generally untrue. How much work do you think it would be to convince you today that Sarah Palin was actually really smart? Probably tough, right? Especially if you've already formed your opinion that she's not, right? And even if I laid out a bunch of facts, even if I said, look, she's a Rhodes Scholar. She's not, by the way, but if I said, she's a Rhodes Scholar, she got admitted to Harvard, she was on the short list for a prize for physics. If I told you all those things, you'd probably go, those can't be true. And you'd be right, by the way, none of those things are true. But it's part of the reason that it gets very, very hard to change your mind. The most effective way to be persuasive in politics, it's two basic ways. One is get to the voter before they formed an opinion. It's one of the reasons why campaigns often spend a lot of money early in the campaign, especially for candidates that you don't know very well, because new candidates, you could form an opinion that you might like them. So the candidate running against them will run a lot of negative stuff early to try and convince you they're really bad, get you to form that opinion they're really bad, and then you won't be able to move off that opinion. That's one way. The other way is what we call elite queuing. Elite queuing, which is a political science, somewhat complicated way of saying, if the leader of your political movement or group or party changes their position, you are more likely to consider changing your position as well. And what that means in a more practical term, for example, for my Republicans out there, most of you probably remember that the Republican Party has generally been a free trade party, a party that supports free trade and is generally opposed to tariffs. And so if we polled up until the Trump administration, you would find that the Republican Party and members that identify as Republicans are overwhelmingly against tariffs. However, and here's the big however, if you poll that during the Trump administration, you will find that many more Republicans have a favorable view of the use of tariffs. So what has changed? The president has championed them. He has said that tariffs are a good thing and I can use them for good results. And as a result, many Republicans have changed their mind about tariffs. That's what we call elite queuing. In other words, a person that leads your party or your group makes it okay for you to change your position. We use that in campaigns, and candidates use that in campaigns all of the time. Here's a pretty good example. How many of you saw the campaign commercial from John McCain's widow? Basically, she did Cindy McCain did a commercial for Joe Biden. Anyone see that? A couple of people. That's a good example of that type of queuing. They use Cindy McCain not because she's, you know, she's a leading political mind, right, or that she's particularly relevant to Florida voters, but she's a Republican, and a Republican that was married to a Republican candidate who ran for president. And so when she gets up there on television and says, Joe Biden is a good guy and I'm going to vote for Joe Biden, she's communicating to Republicans saying that it is okay for you to also support Joe Biden as well. And that's a whole lot more persuasive to Republicans than it would be if Joe Biden got up there and told you how terrible Donald Trump is, right? That doesn't move them, right? Or it tells you that Donald Trump does bad things. They're ready to disbelieve that. But they're willing to give Cindy McCain an opportunity to speak to them because they identify her as being a leader in their ideology, in their party. And her giving them permission to vote for Biden actually is pretty powerful. Even somebody like Kasich, especially in Ohio, where he was the governor, saying that he supports Joe Biden, actually is very powerful in Ohio, where many Republicans respect John Kasich. But that's generally how it works. And one of the reasons that I think this is a particularly interesting and fascinating election is that there was never really a moment during this race where we could really change our minds about the candidates, right? Once it was Joe Biden and Donald Trump, people had pretty well-formed opinions, right? Nobody really needed a lot of time to consider what they thought about Donald Trump. A lot of people really love him, and a lot of people don't like him very much at all, right? And not a lot of people had to make up their minds. And even Joe Biden, who ironically, by the way, had a little bit less recognition than Donald Trump, even though Joe Biden has been in the public eye for decades, right? But he was generally a well-known figure, Obama's vice president. So for a campaign, that was a pretty tough one, right? Because, I mean, no matter how many commercials Donald Trump is going to run, it's probably not going to convince the people that don't like him to change their mind. And the same thing for Joe Biden, right? You know, he can run as many commercials as he wants about the things that he thinks that Donald Trump did wrong, but it's likely not going to have much of an effect on the voters that already like Donald Trump. So in a lot of ways, it's an amazingly non-persuasive election. And I'll show you a little bit later in this presentation the approval ratings for the president and the numbers in the race, just to illustrate for you how little anything seems to have changed, despite all the major news events that have happened during this campaign. It is quite remarkable, actually, in a lot of ways. So what is the secret to the election? I know you came here because you knew I was going to give you the secret, right? Herb knows I'm giving him the secret, right, Herb? The secret is not a secret at all. It really is just a question of turnout. The candidate that turns out their voters at a higher rate is the candidate that will win. And it is not any more complicated than that. They're not persuading anybody. They're not changing a whole lot of minds. They've just got to turn their voters out in higher numbers than their opponent. And that's what you're going to see. That's what the last few weeks of this is going to be about. It's going to be about trying to rally up their voters and make sure they either get to the polls or send in their mail ballots. I mean, how many of you, just thinking today, have gotten calls, postcards, emails from whichever side you're on saying, got to get that ballot in. It's important you get that ballot in. Vote early, vote early. How many of you got something like that? Yeah, that's going to be where the money will be spent, trying to make sure they translate your intentions into actual votes. So I'm going to let you in on the other big secret of campaigns. Television stations love to spend a lot of time with what we call the horse race poll. Pollsters call it the ballot test because we have to make things complicated. But basically, it's the poll question that says, if the election were held today, which candidate would you vote for? But I'm going to let you in on something. That often is not the best question to ask. I know, it seems kind of silly, doesn't it? That should be the best question to ask. So I'm going to do an exercise with you. You can do this with me. Take a look at these two candidates. This is Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. And this is the exit polls from the 2012 election. And so what they did is they asked a series of questions about which candidate they thought the people might identify with, right? They asked which candidate shares their values. Now look at the difference between Obama and Romney there. You can see Obama was at 42%, Romney was at 55%. That's a 13-point spread for Romney. Not too bad on Shares My Values. Is a strong leader. Look at the Obama number there, 38. The Romney number, 61. 61. That's a really good number for Mitt Romney on is a strong leader. Has a vision for the future. You can see Obama at 45%, Romney at 54%. Again, a 9-point spread. Romney has swept the first 3 categories. He's going to win in a landslide, right? I can see Vince laughing there. He already knows how this is going to turn out. At the bottom, look at the last one. Cares about people like me. 81 to 18 in favor of Barack Obama. We call that, by the way, the beer question, because it's the question you ask in this basic way, which is, which candidate would you most like to have a beer with? It's a measure of relatability. It's a measure of when I see that candidate and they talk to me, do they connect with me? Do I feel like that person understands what my problems are, cares about my problems, is willing to go to Washington and fight to solve my problems? Obama won that. Romney didn't, and Obama won this election fairly substantially. So probably not as, I think, Buzzy, your phone is on. Probably not as close as a lot of people thought Romney would be, just because of that relatability factor question. Historically, that has made a really big difference. Take George W. Bush, for example, who is notorious for his occasional verbal flubs. For the record, by the way, I was always super understanding of George W. Bush when he would say something silly. I do it all the time, and I can guarantee you I will do it before the end of this presentation. It's just, when you talk enough, right, you say something silly eventually. My personal favorite, though, was when he used the word strategery. Remember that? Strategery? Yeah, I thought that was pretty amusing, too. I had a colleague, by the way, that printed that out and put it on his door. He called his office the Department of Strategic.
Kevin, Dr. Wagner, we lost your audio. Can you all still hear him, or is it just me?
No, can't hear a thing.
Okay. You could be frozen now, Dr. Wagner.
The audio keeps going in and out anyway.
I've been hearing him pretty well, but you've got your earphones on. So, oh, we lost him, everybody. Oh, there he's back, but now you have to unmute.
Hear me now.
Okay.
Am I back?
You're back.
How much did I miss? When did I stop talking?
When you said your friend had put that sign on his door, we lost you.
Department of Strategery. Oh, while I'm here, by the way, before I put my slides back up, if you have a question, go ahead and throw it in the chat. All right, let me go back to my video. Actually, I'm on my video. Let me go back to my screen share. There we go.
Oh, I have to give it to you. Hey? Oh, I did give it to you.
You did. I'm good. And the next time I stop talking, somebody wave at me. Oh, so I was talking about my colleague, Jason, who put a sign on his door that said Department of Strategery, which I always found amusing. But I always thought George W. Bush did really get the last laugh on that one, because his audio mistakes, what we sometimes call malapropisms, his verbal errors, actually made him very relatable. They got people to say, you know what? I make mistakes too. I stumble over words occasionally too, and I understand that. And it made George W. Bush, a very wealthy man from a very wealthy family, seem like a regular guy. And that is actually a very important characteristic for running for president. You know, by the way, who was also has been his, you know, in his relatively short political career, relatively good at that as well, is Donald Trump. You know, whether you like him or not, he has managed very effectively to take a basically a New York billionaire and make himself very relatable to rural communities, to working class communities, many of whom, if you even just drive around my area down here, you'll see large pickup trucks with double Trump flags on them. He has done a very good job of relating and speaking to a portion of the population that feels as if the politicians generally don't relate to them. It's part of his success in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin was due in large part to his ability to reach those voters who often don't vote and who said, you know what, I'm going to give this Trump guy a chance because he speaks to me. Interestingly, Biden is also a candidate that actually generally does very well with relatability. So what you're looking at is a large glass of beer, which is what I am going to get right after I'm done here. But I put it here because it is basically a reference to the beer question. And what I want you to do is look on the bottom of your screen. You are looking at the cares about people like me, or like you, question, done basically over the course of this year. And if you go down to the bottom row, the May 7th to 10th, you can see Biden had about a 12-point lead on Trump. But you can see generally Trump's numbers did not go down. The people that related to him, 42%, 42%, 41%, you can see generally stayed with him the whole time. And even Biden's numbers didn't change. Where they really kind of went down was in this last time that they measured it. I believe this is an SRS CNN poll. But you can see the last time they measured it, there was about a 20% difference there. And you could see Biden did really well. I think that's more evidence of that really bad week that Trump had in the last week between the release of his taxes through the New York Times, the debate performance, which was really not received terribly well, and of course his contracting of COVID-19. So I think that pushed his numbers down a little bit. I think they'll probably come back up to the low 40s. But you'll notice, by the way, that 42, 42, 41, what does that actually resemble? That's basically pretty close to his approval rating, right? Those are people that really relate to him, that see him, that think about him, and think that he relates to them and he speaks their language. It's not a terrible number. The bad news, though, for Trump is that Biden's number has generally been a bit higher. And Biden, Biden was on the ticket with Obama for the basic reason that Biden was pretty good at a question like this. Biden was the guy that you wanted to put on the ticket to relate, especially to working class voters, because of course Biden comes from a working class neighborhood in, I believe, Scranton, Pennsylvania, and he should be able to speak better to those voters than Barack Obama could. At least Barack Obama thought that he could, and so that was the balance that Biden brought to the ticket. It's the reason why he's a strong candidate this year as well, because Biden has an ability to speak a bit to some of those same voters that supported Trump. And we'll look a little bit later, assuming I have time, to show you that Biden has actually made some inroads with working white voters. Interestingly, by the way, Donald Trump has made some inroads into African-American voters and Latino voters, which you don't hear much about, but there is some evidence that he's made some movement there. The problem for Trump, though, is that what he's made up among African-Americans and Hispanics has not made up for what he's lost among white voters, especially working class voters. Actually, if we're being honest, not just working class voters, but white suburban women is probably the demographic that he has lost the most in. In fact, by the way, I know Trump reads our polls or does his own polls, because I think if you saw in his rally, he asked suburban women to like him, if you remember, because it's showing up in the polls, the big gender gap, especially among suburban women. So I thought I'd share with you, polling is what I do, but polling has a fair amount of relationship to the American voter. And there was a very good book written in the 1960s called The American Voter by a guy named Philip Converse. And he wrote it with some other compatriots. And what they looked at is, among other things, was who the American voter was and what they knew. And the book is famous in political science now for determining a basic problem with modern democracies, which is that many people, many Americans, did not have fixed understandings and positions about many political issues. Put a little more bluntly, a lot of Americans don't seem to know much about anything. And that caused a real sort of democracy problem because of this basic question. If we give the vote to people and we give the power to the people to select leaders, and they don't know a lot about what they're voting about, can democracy really function? I'll let you in on a little, sort of, how this debate went. A lot of scholars adopted a position, Page and Shapiro and some others, that basically said that maybe we don't know a whole lot individually, but together, when we put all our votes together, we generally make wise decisions. I like to call that the black box theory of American voting. But I think about Congress a lot when I see polls like this one. What you're looking at is the National Geographic poll called Aliens Among Us. Aliens Among Us. This was a survey of 1,114 Americans. It was done a few years back, but I like it just for its illustration of where America is.
I want to know about the $150. I hope she gets to that. But she's really good. She's asking all the questions that should have been asked.
Can't hear the speaker.
Yeah, there's somebody on. I think maybe we could just mute everyone again, and then I'll unmute myself. Okay. All right, that's gone. All right. So some of the things that we this survey from National Geographic found was that 36% of Americans believe UFOs exist. 11% have spotted a UFO. 20% know someone who claims to have seen a UFO. And what do all these people have in common? Most of them are voters. What have other polls found? 1 in 5 Americans think that the sun revolves around the Earth. That was a Gallup poll. 1 in 4 Americans don't know which country America gained independence from. Interestingly, in this poll, about 2% thought it was France. 3% thought it was a different country like Mexico, China, or Russia. 19% had no opinion. Apparently, they just had no opinion about who we gained our independence from. Mildly disturbing, right? One third of Americans apparently believes in ghosts. Yep, and they all get to vote. Here are 3 others that may or may not make you too happy. About 1 in 10 think that HTML, that's Hypertext Machine Language, which is, I think that's the correct acronym. Don't quote me on that, though. That's the language that allows you to navigate the internet. 1 in 10 Americans think that HTML is a sexually transmitted disease. 1 in 4 thinks that God helps decide the outcome of football games. And 51% think that stormy weather affects cloud computing, which obviously is not in fact true, but theoretically could be, I guess. No, it can't be. This one is from a PPP poll that is also a little bit older, but I keep it just because of the amazingness of it. Go ahead and drop to the question that you see on the bottom there with me. You see question 38. Would you support or oppose the bombing of Agrabah? This poll asked. This is, again, from PPP. They're generally a political pollster, but occasionally they throw in sort of these kinds of questions. I think mostly to publicize their polls, but I do find them interesting and occasionally disturbing, like I do this one. So they asked, would you support or oppose the bombing of Agrabah? And based on their responses, they got 30% of their respondents to say that they would in fact support the bombing of Agrabah. Now, I know what you're thinking to yourself. You're wondering, where is Agrabah? And that is a fair question to ask. And you would know the answer to this question if you spent a lot of time among small children. Agrabah is, in fact, the fictional city from the movie Aladdin. Aladdin. You're actually looking at a picture of it. It's a cartoon. But I guess in the live-action movie, it wasn't a cartoon. They did a live-action version of it. But basically, 30% of these respondents thought it was a good idea to bomb a fake cartoon city. And they don't take away your right to vote for that. So it is mildly disturbing. The good news, ultimately, for political institutions is that there is some evidence that even though Americans don't individually sometimes get things right, they do in the aggregate often at least vote effectively in their own self-interest, which I guess is at least a rational way to vote. What do we know generally from public opinion? We know, for example, that the president's favorability ratings are not that high, though they are steady, generally in the low 40s to high 30s. We also know that no matter who's president, the least popular institution in the United States? Anyone want to take a guess? United States Congress. United States Congress, which is so strikingly unpopular that some pollsters have tried to find anything that is less popular than the United States Congress. Not with a great deal of success. So I believe this is PPP again, and they asked a series of questions about Congress, including, do you have a higher opinion of Congress or dog poop? And you can see dog poop was the successful winner there. Congress or toenail fungus? Again, a nice win there for toenail fungus. Congress or cockroaches? About a 2% win for cockroaches there, though. In fairness, that might well be within the margin of error. So they might, in fact, be tied between Congress and cockroaches. What's the most popular institution in American politics, at least the federal government? The United States Supreme Court historically has had among the highest approval ratings, but that too is somewhat declining. You're looking at some data from the United States Senate and also from 538, and what they're looking at is trust in the Supreme Court and how that has eroded. And you can see the great deal quite a lot. You can see it was higher in the 60s, 70s, especially the 80s, and you can see it dipping down in 2000, 04, came back a little bit, but still a bit lower now than it was in the 70s and 80s, definitely. And people having no trust is actually a bit on the rise, though. It's a gradual thing. What's the evidence that generally supports that? Look over to the right-hand side of your screen. Oops, sorry. And you can see the confirmation rates of Supreme Court justices. If you go back to 1975, for example, John Paul Stevens actually successfully got almost unanimous vote, right? 98 to 0. You saw Sandra Day O'Connor, 99 to 0. I had the privilege of meeting Sandra Day O'Connor when I did a fellowship up at the United States Supreme Court. She called me at the time a reformed lawyer, because I used to be a lawyer, and now I obviously I'm a college professor, but I kind of like that title. It was nice, and I had a very nice conversation with her. William Rehnquist, 65-33. That was actually close at the time. Antonin Scalia, who even though we perceive him as being highly conservative, right, was generally approved 98 to 0. Robert Bork actually was rejected. That was Nixon's nomination of Robert Bork, 42-58, right? Anthony Kennedy and David Souter, both with large majorities. Clarence Thomas was the one accused of misconduct by Anita Hill, if you'll remember, back in 1991. He actually made it onto the court by a very slim vote there. You can see 52-48. But other than that, Ginsburg, Breyer, Roberts all went on the court relatively easily. Things started to get a bit tighter with Alito, 58-42. Sotomayor actually did pretty well, 68-31. Kagan, 63-37. And then the last two, Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, were the Trump appointees. And you can see those were very, very, very close. But what changed about the court and what makes it a whole lot closer is historically, to get on the Supreme Court, you needed to be able to get at least a portion of the opposing party to support you. And you can see sort of that happened with Sotomayor and Kagan and even Alito and Roberts, right? But the reason you needed at least some of the opposition party to support you was because of the filibuster. And so what that meant is the filibuster is a way that members of the Senate prevent something from going to a vote. In order to overcome the filibuster, you need 60 senators to vote to overcome the filibuster. So if you have, say, a slight majority in the Senate, maybe 52 or 53, you're going to have to convince 7 Democrats to vote to set aside the debate, to set aside the filibuster, and get you to a vote on that Supreme Court justice. The issues changed really in 2016, because if you remember, Merrick Garland was appointed by Barack Obama to fill the seat of the late Antonin Scalia. And Merrick Garland was not given a vote. In fact, he wasn't even given a hearing on the premise, by the way, that one should not put a Supreme Court justice on the Supreme Court during an election year, even though there were, I think, 8 or 9 months to go before the election. But the Senate refused to even give Garland a hearing. Subsequently, after Donald Trump was elected, he nominated Neil Gorsuch, replacing Merrick Garland. And then Gorsuch came before the Senate. He had his confirmation hearings, and when he went to the vote, the Democrats filibustered Gorsuch, arguing that it was unfair to put him in the seat when they blocked Merrick Garland from even having a hearing. In response, the Republicans removed the filibuster. They changed the rules of the Senate so that a candidate could be confirmed without, without 60 votes. All you need is a simple majority. And with that simple majority, you can see 54-45, they put Gorsuch on the court. And subsequently, with the second retirement of Kennedy, Trump got a second appointment, and he put Brett Kavanaugh there. And you can see again, without the filibuster, the Republicans, with just a simple majority, 50-48, were able to put Kavanaugh on the court. One of the downsides of removing the filibuster is that it allows the party in power to put a candidate that cannot get the majority of the Senate or even 60 votes in the Senate on the Supreme Court. In other words, they can pick a much more ideological candidate rather than a more neutral, moderate candidate to put on the court, because they don't need any votes from the opposition. And this will be true, by the way, for Democrats as well. Should Biden win and the Democrats catch the Senate, they could put a far more liberal candidate on the Supreme Court when they get an opening, or should they change the rules of the Supreme Court, because they don't need any Republican votes in order to get that candidate on the court. And that has created a perception of the court as being much more ideological. That's one of the reasons that people's view of the Supreme Court has gotten considerably less, they become a little more cynical about the court than they might have been historically. And some of the polling today sort of illustrates that, people are increasingly wondering whether or not members of the Supreme Court are judges or just politicians in black robes. And that's a difficult thing for the court to have to deal with. But that, I think that is definitely going to be the way politics can go. It is unfortunate that it's headed that way, no matter which side of the aisle you're on. But it's pretty clear that that's where it's headed. So one of the big issues, one of the reasons that the court is highly politicized, and probably will be one of the central issues in today's campaign, is largely because the big issues, like whether or not to keep the Affordable Care Act, whether or not a woman's right to choose, or abortion will be made less illegal, or at least much more difficult to get, all kinds of things like that, are ultimately going to be decided in the courts, mostly because Congress often has an inability to act. And here's a pretty good sort of illustration of how the judiciary has become much more partisan, right? In 2014, there was a judicial challenge to the Affordable Care Act. We sometimes call it Obamacare, but the name of the statute is the Affordable Care Act. And it made its way through a number of different courts and had a number of different rulings about it. The Washington Times examined the rulings, and they calculated them out and came up with this interesting fact. That Democratic appointees, in other words, judges that were appointed by a Democratic president, upheld the Affordable Care Act more than 90% of the time. And while judges that were appointed by Republicans ruled against it about 80% of the time. And when that's happening, when you get such a partisan divide among how judges are ruling, it really does sort of indicate to people that maybe it's not a neutral interpretation of the law that's going on, but rather judges that are hewing to sort of the way that their partisan identification of how these things go. I want to talk a little bit about the election, then I will a little bit more about how the election is going to go, and then we will move on to some questions, because I can see I already have 5 questions. Well, I think they're questions. I can just see a number that says 5. Hopefully that's not people telling me that they can't hear me. All right, I'm okay on that, right, Tammy? Yeah, okay, good. All right, so let's take a look about the election. This is the 2016 election by state. Now, if you looked at that, you would think that the candidate that had the red states won a landslide victory. In fact, the president actually put it as a landslide victory. It looks like a landslide victory, in fairness to the president, doesn't it? But it's geography, right? It's not people. In fact, Hillary Clinton actually won about 3 million more votes than Donald Trump did, which goes to show you in a funny kind of way, these kinds of maps are a little bit deceptive when it comes to at least understanding how the population goes. For example, look over there at Montana, right? or even Wyoming, right? Wyoming is actually the smallest state in the union by population. It would be smaller than the District of Columbia by population if the District of Columbia were actually allowed into the union to be its own state. But Wyoming is really small. Anyone know how small it is? It's about 500,000 or 600,000 votes, depending on whether you count cattle and whether it's cattle season. Palm Beach County, where we all live in, is about 1.2 million, maybe as high as 1.4 million during the season. So we're roughly twice the size of Wyoming in population. But you can see Palm Beach County would be a tiny little speck on this map, while Wyoming is obviously a big chunk of this map. And that's part of the reason that population can be somewhat deceptive when you look at it like maps like this. This is the 2016 election where they broke it down by county. And you can see over on the left by precinct, I think that is. And you can see, obviously, it's a little more informative, but it still looks overwhelmingly like Donald Trump won pretty easily, even though it was a very close election. This is what the map would look like if you weighted the country by population instead of just a geographical area. And this looks like a little more even, right? This looks a little bit closer. You could almost believe that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by a few million on this, but it looks pretty close. It's a tie. This is, the networks won't use a map like this primarily because, to be honest, it looks like something my third grader would draw. It actually looks kind of like a dog to me with a fluffy tail. I don't know if you see that or not. Maybe it's a Rorschach moment there. This would be the same distribution by. This one's done a little bit differently. Instead of just painting areas red or blue based on how they voted, they shade it by the difference between the vote. In other words, the margin. The closer it is, the more purple it is, and the more Republican it is, the more red it is, the more Democrat it is, the more blue it is. And you can see that the country actually has quite a bit of purple in it. In other words, a mix of Republicans and Democratic voting. Let me show you just interestingly. This is 2008, and this was the landslide victory for Barack Obama. Now you can see the maps look somewhat similar, right? A few differences here, right? But generally pretty similar, which goes to show you ultimately that there isn't a whole lot of mind changing. You can get pretty big victories one way or the other without whole swaths of the map really changing in any real way. All right, I will make you slightly more amused today. How many of you watched the last debate, the first debate, maybe the only debate we're going to see? Anyone watch it? I watched it. You watched it. So I don't know if this will amuse you or horrify you. This is a measure of Google search. And you can see right around the time of the debate, there was a spike in the number of people searching for move to Canada. Move to Canada. So you can see that surge in the people that watched the debate and decided that the thing they wanted to search for was move to Canada. Similarly, Merriam-Webster's dictionary actually has a website where people can look up words on their website. By the way, very handy if you ever need a dictionary and can't find the physical dictionary around the house. You can go there. According to Webster's official Twitter account, which they tweeted out for us most kindly, the top queries during the debate in the dictionary website were the following words: petulant, fascism, and racism, which might tell you that debate did not go well for anybody. Let's get past here. One of the questions people ask me is, are newspapers relevant anymore? And I will tell them, sometimes they are. It just depends on where you are. This was something a friend of mine got me to notice and sent it to me, sent me a clip of this to take a look at. And this apparently is something somebody put in the paper. Says, I want to clear things up. Jack and Alice Cottrell do not have the virus. So whoever is saying that, they need to keep their mouth shut. Apparently they put that in their newspaper, which goes to show you, at least some people think the newspapers are still relevant. I'm going to skip like 27, a few of the slides I have, because I want to show you something about the election before I run out of time. Maybe if I come back, Tammy, I have lots of other material and stuff to talk about. This is the president's approval ratings as of today. Actually, I think I did this yesterday, so it might be as of yesterday. And you can see It's 53 disapprove, 43 approve. Notice the 43 is pretty close to the 42, 41 that say that that president cares about me. Those are pretty steady numbers for him. The real thing I want you to notice, though, is look across time, right? See how the lines don't really budge a whole lot. That is pretty amazing if you think about how much news has happened between COVID and all of the things that we had to deal with, and the Black Lives Matter and the rallies and protests and some of the violence that we've seen in cities. Despite all of that, notice how steady his numbers tend to be. The people that like the president really like him, and the people that don't like him really don't like him. And it's pretty hard to change that in any real material way. This is the Washington Post ABC poll. And you can see in July, it was 53-43 Biden. And by September, it was 53-43 Biden. I mean, another sort of good example of nothing much changing in a particular poll. If you look at the trend line of national polls, you can see that 52-42, that 10-point Biden advantage, pretty steady. Look, June, July, August, September, October, remarkably unmoving. And in case you're curious, I put this here just earlier today. This is a 538, which is a blog, and they put together the averages of the polls. They modeled it between Clinton and Trump, and you can see, look at how much closer the Clinton-Trump numbers are than the Biden-Trump numbers, generally speaking. Clinton generally had a lead, and you can see that at this point, mid-October, she had about a 6-point lead, not quite as large as Biden's 10-point lead, but not an insubstantial one. But you can see that there were times when this was considerably closer than Biden's was. I think the biggest difference in this election versus the previous one is that Biden's numbers have been, and Trump's numbers have been much more steady. This, like I said before, it doesn't mean that Trump can't turn this around. It doesn't mean that he can't win it. He certainly can win. And I don't even think that's a hugely unlikely outcome. It's a little less likely than Biden winning. But I certainly don't want anyone to read into this that he can't win, because I don't believe that. I don't think that's accurate. But it does indicate that it's a tougher hill for him to climb this time around than it was in 2016. So let me pop over to some of these questions just to see if there's anything interesting here that I should be answering. Oh, I have 11 in the chat. Let's see what we got. No audio in Canada. Hopefully you have your audio back, Stan. How much does character count in people's evaluation? Quite a bit, Donald. Quite a bit. One of the illustrations is that relatability question. Well, I suppose I should answer a little bit differently. Character, depending on how you define it, might not matter as much. Relatability really matters. In other words, there's a lot of people that may not like the way Trump talks, but they do find him relatable, and that can matter. I thought Harry Reid got rid of the filibuster. A good question, Eric, an excellent question. Harry Reid did, in fact, get rid of part of the filibuster. He got rid of part of the filibuster that had to do with lower court judges. What he didn't do was get rid of the blue card, which allowed senators to block seats. So one of the things that Donald Trump inherited was a lot of open seats, because Harry Reid would only go sort of halfway on that. But it was and in fairness to Eric's question, one of the justifications that Mitch McConnell gave for removing the filibuster on Supreme Court justices was the fact that Democrats removed the filibuster on lower court judges. So that actually is a fair question. Interesting one, Eric. Let's see what else you got here. Such good questions. It's one of the reasons I really like this group. Right, that was the same question on Harry Reid. What do you think? What do you folks in Canada think of our election craziness? I guess that's to everyone. I'll let the folks in Canada answer that, though. I have a very good friend who's a pollster in Canada, and he says that that most Canadians find American politics unfathomable, which I wouldn't necessarily disagree with. Can you send a copy of the slideshow? I think the thing is recorded. Though generally, I don't like to give out my my slides, mostly because they're sort of my work product, and I'm happy sharing, talking to you about them, but I change them, and I don't, I have this weird idea that someone's going to go grab my slide and use it somewhere else or something like that, and so I'm not a big fan of that. What else is in the chat here? How much of an effect has the Lincoln Project and Republicans against Trump had? Well, Ellen, you sure like to ask difficult questions, don't you? There's not a lot of data on that, and I don't know how many of you saw the 60 Minutes piece on the Lincoln Project. Yeah, it was a very interesting piece, and they did raise this basic question: is the Lincoln Project essentially preaching to the choir? In other words, are the people that are consuming this people that already were against Donald Trump, and it's not reaching them? Their argument is that they're targeting it towards Republicans that might have otherwise voted for Trump, and their argument is that if they can move it a couple of points, that might be enough to help defeat him. And I have to tell you, the general premise isn't necessarily wrong, but I don't necessarily know that they're moving it 2 points. What I will tell you is it clearly irritates the president, who really doesn't like them at all, and maybe that's enough for them. But I don't know the answer to the question, Alan, and I'm not going to make one up for you. When I don't know, I'll tell you I don't know, and I don't know. Hopefully, we'll have some exit polls after the election where we can go back and see what kind of information they consumed, and then we can give you a more reasonable answer. I know it would make more sense if I could tell you beforehand, but there isn't a lot of data there. Yeah. So, and Eric was on there. Steve Schmidt is particularly engaging. Yeah, I mean, look, I have to tell you, I've watched a lot of them. I can't say I've seen them all, but they're certainly well produced and pretty hard hitting. I just don't know how big an impact they're ultimately going to have on any of this. So it wasn't nearly as many questions as I thought.
If anybody have any questions, you can unmute yourselves. You don't have to put it in our chat necessarily.
I have Tammy.
Okay. Just
Sheila.
go for it.
Okay, you got it? Yeah, Dr. Wagner, you said that people don't change their mind. Then what's the purpose of all those commercials on TV?
Very good question.
Political party. Seems it's not going to work.
Yeah, it's a good question, Sheila. So I would say there's two main reasons that they do it. Probably three, if I can be honest. One is if you have a lot of money anyway, it's tradition to spend a lot of money on television, so they're going to do it. Both candidates have a ton of money. The second reason they do it is it's not necessarily to persuade people; it's to energize people. It's to get the people that are really, let's say you're a supporter of the president, but it's been a rough year. COVID-19's been tough. You don't know whether or not you're really going to, spend the time to either request a ballot or go out. And you see a commercial and it's a Trump rally and it's excited and it gets that energy up. It helps you remember why you really like the president so much. And then you're going to go out and vote. So it's to energize a lot of those voters that are leaning your way and get them, strong enough to actually go vote. And finally, while there aren't a lot of persuadable voters, there are some, right? And in states where it's really close, even if it's just 1 or 2% that you're going to persuade, and even if it costs you a ridiculous sum of money to do it, if that 2% makes the difference, right? Then it'll be worth the money. But you're right; it's not the most cost-effective way to campaign. That is for sure. That is for sure. Anyone else?
What do you think is going to? What do you think the effect will be of after the election? The challenges. It seems that both parties are ramping up their attorneys to challenge in the different states and districts.
Yeah,
so that's one part of the question. The second part is, how far do you think that they can carry this up until January 20th?
Yeah. Okay. So good question, Vince. So I did I moderated a panel yesterday. This is how I spend my evenings. Right? My wife is out there wondering what I do all the time. I'm in here on the computer. I moderated a panel yesterday with the supervisor of elections from Palm Beach County, which is Wendy Link, and from Broward County, which is Tanachi, I think his name is. I hope I pronounced it better when he was actually on the video with me. And that question actually came up, which is what lawsuits do you expect are likely to happen? And both of them sort of dodged the question. And basically said that they expect to be able to do the count well. They don't think that but they're not not going to speak to what other people might do or not do. I think that Vince, the real answer is this: if we put aside the legal question, technical legal question, and we just treat it like a political question, here's the basic answer. If it's close, if it's really close, where, you know, yeah, a few thousand votes could make the difference between who wins Florida and who doesn't, I think you will find both sides sending every lawyer they can to go in and search for ballots that were either set aside because of signatures or were disqualified for reasons, and argue that these ballots should be counted, and that could go on for a while. I mean, and you will see fights. Remember in 2000 we had those hanging chads, and we're trying to debate whether or not, you know, this particular voter or that particular voter ballot should count. I think you will find a ton of that if it's really close. If it's not close, you know, if one of the candidates, either Mr. Trump or Mr. Biden, wins, you know, by hundreds of thousands of votes, and it's pretty clear that then I don't think you'll see anything at all, because it just won't be worth the time or effort. But if it's close, all bets are off. How long can it take? So after Election Day, there's 41 days between Election Day and when the Electoral College votes. So there's a little bit of time for I think somebody put in the chat there, Mashugana. There's room for bad things to happen. I actually wrote a column about this. I'm a little bit familiar, but if something happens so that neither candidate gets a majority of the Electoral College, either some states don't report their Electoral College votes, or if you know, if awfully enough, you know, some electors are disloyal and they vote for somebody other than who they're supposed to vote, or if there's a tie, which actually could happen, right? You could have a 270-270 tie. What happens is the United States Congress picks the president. Yeah, it's what the 12th Amendment of the Constitution say. So basically, in January, when the totals are reported to Congress, the House of Representatives picks the president, and the Senate picks the vice president. But it's kind of interesting, and I know I'm going to get highly technical here, but the way the House of Representatives votes is by state. So each state delegation counts as one vote. So that the first person to 26 votes becomes the president. And think about what that means. It means a state like California, which has, oh, don't quote me on this, but I think it's 53 representatives, gets the exact same weight as Wyoming, which has one representative, right? But that's the way that's what the Constitution reads. If the House can't decide, in other words, they can't get to anyone to 26, the Senate picks the vice president, and if they're able to pick the vice president-elect then becomes the president. So a lot of weird things could happen, right? You could get President Trump and Vice President Harris if the Senate becomes Democratic, right? Or you could get President Biden and Vice President Pence if the Senate holds on to the Republicans hold on to the Senate. Or you could get neither of them, right? And if neither the House or the Senate can actually come to a conclusion about it, you go to the Succession Act, which is a law, and the person who would become president then, ready, anyone know?
Nancy Pelosi.
Maybe, right? Maybe. It's the Speaker of the House, but it's the new Congress. So it depends on how the ballot came out for the new Congress and who they picked as their Speaker. But let's assume the Democrats hold on to the House, and they keep Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker. That in that particular case, Nancy Pelosi would then become the acting president. That is how crazy things could get. Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
Before they get to that one, I thought that in the House that they voted by delegation. Today it would be the Republicans would pick the president, right?
Yeah. So, yeah.
The Republican delegations. Then
they vote by state delegations. That's what I was trying to say. I guess I didn't make it terribly clear, so my apologies on that. So, for example, all the representatives from California vote together as one vote, and all the representatives of Florida vote together as one vote. And you're right. Currently, right now, the Republicans control more state delegations, even though the Democrats control more representatives. So yeah. So theoretically, if it stayed the same, then the Republicans would have the advantage there. But remember, every seat in the House of Representatives is up for vote right now. So we don't know exactly what the House is going to look like come January 10th, which is when we would know. So really good questions, Vince. I don't know if I answered them well for you, but I guess the short answer is super complicated. Super complicated. Anyone else? This is fun.
Kevin, can I ask you a question about the Florida has balloting right now, mail-in balloting, Are the votes being tallied up now, or are they waiting until after the election day to count the votes of the mail-aways?
Super glad you asked me that question. And I know the answer because I listened to it from the supervisors of election yesterday. It was a pretty cool event, by the way. It's called Town Square. Broward College puts it on periodically, and they bring on interesting people. I quite like it. It was fun. It was fun to moderate with them. So this is what they said. They said that they tabulate them, but they don't count them. In other words, they go into the computer, but they're not. There's no running total. Nobody can access that until election day. So for that, it's a very good question, Eric, because ultimately what it means is that Florida quite likely, unless something disastrously bad happens, which is always possible, right? This is Florida, for heaven's sake, right? Florida should be able to get the count done relatively quickly, if not the night of, certainly by the next day. So assuming everything goes well. Some states, like Pennsylvania, don't allow them to even open the mail-in ballots until the day of the election, which means that Pennsylvania is likely to still be counting for several days at least, maybe as much as a week or a week and a half. And if it comes down to that, I mean, literally everyone's going to be staring at Pennsylvania waiting for that vote to come in. The only good news with that is hopefully it won't be us here in Florida.
So if Biden took Florida and we knew by 11:30 at night on November 3rd that Biden took Florida, would that be enough to win the election for Biden? Would that show good Trump was doing that Florida? That's
a good question. The technical answer to your question is that would not be enough. A practical answer to your question is that, yeah, it's probably over at that point. It's very hard to come up with an electoral college victory for the Republican Party at this point that doesn't include Florida. Florida is one of the few battleground states with enough electoral votes to make a big difference. And so if President Trump did not win Florida, you'd have to find other states to make it up in, and it'd be very, very hard for him to do. I suspect if you're watching television and they call Florida for Biden, you will see a lot of the pundits on television start saying that this thing is all over but the shouting. I'm a little hesitant to say that because obviously strange things can happen, but the probabilities for the Republicans go down sharply. If Trump wins Florida, though, then we're probably in for a long election struggle, because then we're going to start looking at North Carolina, we're going to start looking at Arizona, we're going to start looking at those Rust Belt states. Certainly we're going to look at Georgia, but we're going to look at Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, maybe even Ohio. So it gets much more complicated if Trump is able to win Florida. But these are great questions. I love it.
Not mention Texas, and there's been some talk lately about Texas possibly being going blue from historically being red, basically because of the large Latino population that is now becoming very active.
Yeah, that's a good question. I've seen a lot of coverage in the news. I have a colleague at one of the Texas universities who told her students that she will paint her hair blue if the Democrats flip Texas. That's her way of saying that she doesn't think it's terribly likely. I'm not an expert on Texas politics. Florida's more my thing, for good reason. This is where I live. My general feel of it is that Texas is getting closer every election cycle. I still think you're probably at least 1 or 2 election cycles away before we can really call Texas a battleground state. But it is certainly getting more competitive. That is for sure. Part of I didn't really talk about this during the lecture, but it's probably worth mentioning a couple of ways. Pollsters, we spend a lot of time talking about what voters say they're going to do. And even if they're being honest with us, it doesn't necessarily mean that's what's going to happen, right? Because there are a lot of things that could interfere with people voting, right? And if the rules make it really hard, if the lines are really long, like one of the things that we're seeing in Texas, for example, is that the early voting lines are really long. So how many voters do you think who might have voted in Texas, who told pollsters that they were voting in Texas, took a look at that line and said, you know what, there are far better things for me to do with my time. And so, depending on what the rules look like, depending on how hard it is for people to vote, you could lose a point or two here. And if Democrats are likely going to flip Texas, they would need everything to go right, I think. And I'm not sure, the Texas governor reducing every county to 1 drop-off ballot location, that's probably going to cost the Democrats some votes there, and maybe enough to keep the state from being all that competitive It might not have mattered. Texas is still a bit of a red state, but we'll see. I mean, it's a good question. I think it's a little wistful thinking at this point until we see better evidence that Democrats can flip the state, but it is a good question. Anyone else?
Anybody else?
All right. We're just having a conversation, me and Vince.
You have any, you were talking about all the swing states. Do you have any predictions? What is very interesting to me is Lindsey Graham. Do you have any predictions?
Senate race in South Carolina.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, look, I haven't studied those numbers as close as I've studied the Florida numbers, but I mean, I'll give you my gut instinct. My gut instinct is that Lindsey Graham will win that probably by a few points. South Carolina is such a red state, and Donald Trump is going to win that thing going away. Interestingly, Donald Trump's numbers are better in South Carolina than Lindsey Graham's numbers are, which I find interesting and probably a little disturbing if I were Lindsey Graham. But with that said, I mean, a lot of things would have to go perfectly right for Graham, for Harrison to beat Graham in that state. And I don't know. I go with probabilities and the odds. My guess is that Graham probably holds on to that stuff. But it's a good question. It's interesting. Yeah, look, the fact that we're talking about a Senate race in South Carolina, that's interesting because usually it's not that interesting. But my guess, I mean, there's a few of them that are close. Some of the Senate races in Georgia are close too. Though I mean, I would generally think the Republicans will probably hold on to those. I'm a little less certain of those in Georgia than I am in South Carolina. Montana has a competitive race, but again, that's another race where you think the Republicans probably will win. But there's an interesting Senate race in Alaska. I mean, here's the crazy thing. If Democrats really, if it was such a huge sweeping blue year, Democrats could theoretically pick up Senate seats in 2 in Georgia, 1 in South Carolina, 1 in Montana. Iowa, that one actually looks like super competitive. I don't have an opinion on that one. Greenfield maybe will beat Joni Ernst in that one. The ones that the Democrats look like they're definitely going to pick up include Maine. Gideon has been ahead in just about every poll in that state. Hickenlooper's solidly ahead in Colorado. Kelly is ahead in Arizona. Those look like straight Democratic pickups. The one that's clearly going to be a Republican pickup is Alabama. Most of the polling in there has a pretty clear Republicans are going to win that one. But the other ones look pretty favorable towards Democrats. But we'll have to see. I mean, the funny part about politics is you get nothing for second place, even a close second place, right? You just get to go home. And so if all the Democrats do is make competitive races where there weren't competitive races, they might get a moral victory out of that. But you got to win them in order to control the Senate, right?
Question: the legitimacy of this election has been brought up. How do you feel that would impact overall turnout and the general election?
Well, the one thing we can say about turnout is, at least the initial indicators are, is that turnout is going to be really high, among the highest. That also was a question that was brought up yesterday with the supervisors of election, and both of them, Democrats, we had Democrats and Republicans on the panel. That's something I liked. It was a pretty well-balanced panel. And everybody was basically of the opinion that they thought the election was going to be fair and the election was generally going to be high turnout. I think sort of what you're getting at, Michael, though, is sort of the implication that the president suggested that, in fact, I think he's actually said some variation of if he doesn't win, it must have been because something was done, illicitly or incorrectly or illegally. I think that's troubling. I wish the president wouldn't say things like that because having faith on our electoral system is important. But if the president were to react to a loss, if he does lose, right, of course he can certainly win. But if he were to lose and he reacts to a loss by suggesting the election were unfair or done illicitly or illegally or something to do with mail-in ballots, then it might cause a good number of people to be upset about that, and that could be a problem. I mean, one of the hallmarks of a stable democracy is, right, that that parties win and parties lose, and we accept the outcomes. Richard Nixon was famous for when he lost his election. There were some pretty good allegations that there might have been a bit of valid, what's a kind way of putting it, infirmity in Chicago, among other places, where the party machines work. And there was some opportunity for Nixon, who gets a lot of criticism, I would point out, and well-deserved criticism. But But in this particular case, Nixon, people came to Nixon and said, you can challenge this election. There's some evidence that some of Kennedy's votes are improper, and in places like Illinois were really close. And Nixon decided not to do that for a number of reasons. Some of them, because there were parts of the election he didn't want to bring up, but for an overall good reason, which is the American people need an answer, and challenging the election is bad for America in a way that makes people lose faith in elections. And I think that in a political career that had a lot of ups and downs, that was a pretty high moment for Nixon. Even Al Gore, just to give a Democratic version of the same thing, he could have made a pretty good argument in 2000 that the Supreme Court had no business deciding whether Florida should be having a recount or not. In fact, as I pointed out earlier today, if there's a dispute about the Electoral College, it goes to the Congress. There's nothing in there that says the Supreme Court. So when the Supreme Court told Florida you had to stop counting your votes and that George W. Bush was going to be the winner, Al Gore could have gone on TV and said, I reject that. I don't recognize the authority of the Supreme Court to make that decision. And he might have had a pretty good legal argument. But what did Gore do? Gore got out there and he said, I disagree with the decision, but I respect it. And that is the tradition of America. And I hope both candidates, if Biden loses, I hope he's gracious in congratulating the winner. And if Trump loses, I hope he is equally as gracious. That's what makes democracy work. And I hope people of all sides can come together and recognize that when we have an election, we respect the outcomes. Anyone else?
We'll see.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you so much. Dr. Wagner, thank you for coming here this evening. And I think this was certainly a little bit more entertaining than those, what do we have going on tonight? Those town hall meetings?
Yeah, a few of those.
Don't worry, I'm recording both of them. I will watch them both.
Yeah, we are too.
I pity you.
Well, good.
Really
So
great.
we will.
Really excellent.
Yes, thank you. And then we will have this recording uploaded to our YouTube channel as soon as we get the recording, probably up tomorrow.
Thank you, Tammy. Thank you.
Thank you, Tammy.
Thank you.